Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to participate. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for accommodating my language limitations. It's really an honor to be here. So, here we go. I think I'll skip what I was going to say because that situates my topic pretty well, I think, already. I would add that insofar as what I'm trying to do is tell the story of analog photography, I guess, uh, that the fact that the concept of the analog has come to dovetail with that of retro is only part of the story, but it is a particularly instructive part of it, I think, whether our objective is to better understand the significance of the current iteration of what is considered retro, or to better understand the significance of analog. In any case, what I will specifically argue today is that Tacita Dean and the Lomographic Society International are two major figures who have imagined and promulgated the distinct category of analog photography as an apparatus, an industrial legacy, and a material culture. The presentation begins with some establishing background information about each of my case studies. Proceeds to clarify and expand on my main argument, and then offers by way of evidence what is unfortunately due to time constraints and the folly, I think, of choosing two case studies, only a cursory analysis of the actual practices of Dean and the lomography movement. Tacita Dean is a multimedia gallery artist, noted not just for her preference for film as an artistic medium, but for her utter devotion to its particular materiality at the time of a large-scale cultural and infrastructural shift towards digitization. Her oeuvre and her reputation, in fact, are such that they have made her the more or less official poster child for a major turn-of-the-century art world trend. Claire Bishop is just one critic who has noted that even as the world turned digital, the cinematic apparatus was put on widespread display in the art gallery, the historical circumstances of its imminent disappearance having, on the one hand, transformed its material remains into a monument to their own obsolescence, and on the other, prompted a large-scale reconsideration of its particular properties and values. But Dean's is not just a commitment to the aesthetic and ontological characteristics of photographic film, nor even to the metaphors of passing and loss, reverence and presence and materiality, history and temporality that this medium enables her to explore. Her artistic investment in the aesthetics of obsolescence is in fact quite directly tied to her parallel identity as an activist, one who has tethered her interests to those of the film industry in an effort to save her beloved artistic medium from its threatened extinction. The story goes that in 2011, she received notice from the staff at Soho Film Laboratory that under the direction of their new owners, Deluxe, the processing of 16mm film was to be stopped immediately. Bewildered and distressed themselves, management rushed on her behalf, working around the clock to complete her current jobs in time for the imminent shutdown. For future projects, however, including her then recent commission to install in the Tate Modern's Turbine Hall, she would have to look to the continent. Devastated and panicked, and clearly not one to sit around, Dean immediately reached out to Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg, both of whom are known to be sympathetic toward the plight of film, even 16mm. Within a week, she had also published an impassioned and subsequently much cited op-ed in The Guardian, whose title beseeches Save Celluloid for Art's Sake. It was soon after that her launch of the organization and website savefilm.org transformed these initial gestures into something of an official movement. 4 years on, in 2015, we found her collaborating with director Christopher Nolan and Academy Museum of Motion Pictures director Carrie Broffer on an event that she has since referred to as the ground zero of their now shared campaign, but which was officially titled Reframing the Future of Film. Only a month earlier, Nolan had been part of a coalition of directors who had helped seal a deal between Kodak and all of the major Hollywood studios, thereby guaranteeing a market, at least for the short term, for the continued manufacture of 35mm motion picture film. Now in March, Dean's event found a group of And I'm quoting her account of the event that she published in Art Store. Dean's event found a group of, quote, individuals from all areas of film use assembled at the Getty Center in Los Angeles, quote, to develop strategies that would sustain, reinvigorate, and encourage the use of film. Participants included, again, quote, institutional heads and representatives from various archives and organizations, including the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, the Film Foundation, the Film Society of Lincoln Center, the Sundance Institute, George Eastman House, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Photocam, and notably here, Kodak. According to Dean, the entire program concluded with a rousing speech from Kodak's then CEO, Jeff Clark. "We're all in on film," he said, "and I couldn't say that 6 months ago." Dean says that people cried. I suspect that maybe it was her who cried. As she writes in the account of the meeting that she published in Art Forum, quote, "Had we lost Kodak, we would have lost film." Meanwhile, elsewhere and in a decidedly different vein, another party had similarly declared itself film's preeminent advocate and custodian, in this case focusing not on the moving image, but primarily, not exclusively, more recently, but primarily on still photography. Today, the Lomographic Society International has widespread recognizability as a global lifestyle brand whose proprietary films, plastic toy cameras, and various other fashion and photography accessories, and even stationery, have over the past 15 years increasingly been made available for sale at Urban Outfitters, in gift shops, on Amazon, and from their own website and brick-and-mortar shops. It is also a community that holds exhibitions, congresses, and competitions, publishes books and an online magazine, and maintains what they call embassy stores, a website, and an app, all with the purpose of promoting not just sales, but its own distinctive culture and worldview. In fact, while the Lomographic Society has functioned as a business almost from the beginning, its origin was really as a collective, and even more properly as a sort of non-art art movement, a self-styled avant-garde characterized by a deliberately amateurish snapshot aesthetic, a commitment to the values of spontaneity, contingency, and authenticity, and most importantly, devotion to one particular iconic camera from the Soviet era, the Lomo LCA. The Lomo LCA was a rough imitation of a similar compact snapshot camera from Japan, designed to be unfussy and affordable by the St. Petersburg-based firm Lomo plc, or Leningrad Optical and Mechanical Enterprise. For a time, it was one of the most popular cameras in the communist world. Then, as the story goes, in 1991, the de-escalation of the Cold War made it possible for a small group of Viennese students to venture a weekend trip to Prague, where they discovered the Lomo LCA in their wanderings through a camera shop. Enthralled, as they put it, with, quote, its strange little black body and curious click of its shutter, enraptured by the quirky light effects and saturated colors of the photographs that it produced, and taken also, it seems, with the history of its widespread popularity not just in Russia, but in other communist countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Cuba, they have referred to it as, quote, a special compact camera for the proletariat. The students excitedly brought the camera home with them to Vienna. There, a year later, they officially founded the Lomographic Society. The students envisioned their enterprise, as I have said, as a kind of self-styled anti-art avant-garde, a community, and a way of life. The harsh industrial and economic realities of their political and historical environment, however, compelled the Lomographers to sustain that commitment to the Lomo LCA by becoming also its intrepid rescuers. This is to say that the nature of its project is such that it has required securing access to a foreign product from a bygone era, or at least a quickly passing one. At first, this meant that the early Lomographers had to essentially become mules, smuggling cameras in sacks by the hundreds from Prague to Vienna. But before long, it would mean becoming custodians of the camera's industrial legacy in a literal sense. In 1995, after months of meetings, the Lomographic Society signed an exclusive contract with Lomo plc, thereby securing their rights to sell the camera and at the same time staving off the threat of a factory shutdown. That is, at least until that shutdown did have to happen in 2005, at which point the Lomographic Society knuckled in even deeper. They found a new manufacturer, this time in China, who helped them to initiate a reboot of both the camera, which was reissued as the LCA Plus, and the lomography brand itself. This moment marks a major turning point in the history of the Lomographic Society, when the results of an internally administered survey revealed that its members preferred that the group remain loyal to its analog foundations. The organization committed to a new mission. It would become not just the keeper, but the arbiter of analog photography's future. That an engagement with obsolete photographic technologies is furthermore a fundamental aspect, not just of the group's identity, but of its public image, is attested to by the fact that when in the early stages of my research, I mentioned to others that I was writing about the life of analog photography in the digital age, I was very often answered with one question: are you going to write about lomography? If anything is clear thus far about my reasons for pairing these two drastically different case studies, it will be that both Dean and the Lomographic Society have explicitly and loudly positioned themselves as film's primary saviors and devoted advocates. That their doing so has required a slew of industry collaborations and acquisitions speaks to a shift. Industry has transformed from a background condition of practice into a cultural heritage in itself. The differences between the case studies is significant too. They represent the split personality that marks the photographic leg of the larger phenomenon that has frequently been called the analog return. What we have here is the old school professionals' investment in the rescue and revival of heritage institutions on the one hand, and youth culture's thriving embrace of the old plastic toy camera on the other. There is more to my interest in these case studies, however, and that is that both have engaged in a deliberate way with the concept of the analog itself. In Dean's case, the concept is an ongoing theme that has threaded its way through her thinking and her writing over a significant period of time. In 2006, the same year that she produced a film that she calls Kodak, it was chosen as the title for a major exhibition that she mounted at the Schaulager Museum in Switzerland. 2011, that's the catalog on the left. 2011 was a watershed year. As part of her response to the Soho Film Lab's quote, media eviction, she made her installation at the Tate Modern's Turbine Hall into a monument to film itself, a literal portrait that she literally and simply titled Film. To accompany the installation, she produced a publication in which 81 major public and intellectual figures were asked to reflect on the ongoing importance of analog film. The Lomographic Society, for its part, surveyed its membership about the importance of analog photography in 2005, hosted a booth at the industry conference Photo Kino with the moniker The Analog Counter Revolution in 2006, entitled their booth at the same conference The Future is Analog in 2010. In 2008, the Society authored what they have chosen to call the 10 Prophecies for an Analog Future. They're very silly, so I don't want to read them all to you, but I'll point to the one at the right because I mentioned it again later. Film and paper ensure originality, authenticity, and eternity. Analog is what the media scholar Benjamin Peters has liked to call a digital keyword. It is a term that began to circulate widely in popular contexts only in the 1980s. In fact, it turns out on a closer examination that analog photography as such, that is, as a distinct and recognizable category that we referred to that way, did not even exist, could not have done, until the particular conditions of the information age created the rhetorical and conceptual need for it. Like the larger analog concept of which it is part, the notion of an analog photography is but a product of digitization, a rhetorical construct, and the very definition of an obsolete photographic medium in the way that it is understood. This means that when analog circulates today as a way of making sense of our current media environment, as in the concept of the analog return, or even in media scholar Florian Kramer's more erudite version, the neo-analog, its doing so is the relic not of a deeper past, but rather of the more recent history of the digital turn. Where it is clear that Dean and the lomography movement are key figures in what has been the 21st century phenomenon of an ostensibly revived analog photography, that they are representative of this phenomenon it is clear that they are representative of this phenomenon precisely because their respective projects have been formative of it. My contention is that their respective contributions lie not just in the assurance of film photography's continued availability and significance, but in their very elaboration and mobilization of the analog concept in itself. To this end, it is striking that both have grasped onto the concept at a turning point in their trajectories, at a moment that marries its identity with the old and dead to the idea of a triumphantly alternative future. Many have liked to note, with particular reference to the digital life of analog photography and elsewhere, that it is typical for the past to be refracted through the image of the present. Erica Balsam, Margaret Iverson, and my own advisor, Christine Ross, are just three scholars who have argued in this vein that Dean fruitfully reimagines analog photography in terms of its relation to contingency, time, history, the real, and even ruination itself. I would add to this that as the analog concept has transitioned from a rhetorical construct tied to debates about technological change to a conceptual category with significant cultural purchase, Dean and lomography are two players who have linked the sense of its authenticity not just to an understanding of the medium's inherent indexicality, but to a vision of the medium as a system and an apparatus. Even more specifically, I contend that they figure it as a system whose infrastructure includes the industry and institutions that support it, and that it is experienced as the participation in a material culture. It stands in demonstration of this point that Dean, for her part, does not just write that, quote, everything we can quantify physically is analog, that thinking too becomes analog when it is materialized into a concrete form. There's a longer version of her quote right there. She also writes that analog, which has now come to mean all that is not digital, proposes a place, a mountain, a realm of the mind that can be reached by those who feel that it is possible, in fact necessary, to do so. When she writes that, she's influenced by this book on the left. She is outspoken and impassioned about the challenges that she faces in convincing venues to accommodate the technical needs of her apparatus, about the collaboration with industry players like Kodak that sustains her advocacy work, and about the practical applied purposes that persist for film, like medical imaging and archiving. And as she makes her case for the medium's inherent artistic value, she often lingers not on its aesthetic and ontological properties so much as her own experience with it. She explains that her coming to the medium in the first place was serendipitous, but that she learned it almost entirely through experience, and she describes the protracted, isolated, artisanal nature of her practice of manually cutting and splicing her footage alone in her studio on the one hand, and the collaborative nature of her back and forth with the technicians in labs waiting for their results and their inputs on the other. And then, of course, there is her work. Film is known in part for its use of a roster of antiquated and unusual formal techniques, including the innovation of a new kind of mask that was actually printed using a 3D printer. And Kodak, itself a response to the news that the Kodak factory in France was soon to shut down its film production facility, does take as its main subject the manufacture of celluloid film, but it also shows this substrate as not so much a physical material presence in itself, but as a pulsing vitality that must be carefully cultivated and finessed by laboring factory workers as it connects and animates the machinery around it. Sorry, I don't have time to linger on that. As for lomography, for all that its driving ethos revolves around values like contingency and authenticity, one of its key characteristics is that its beloved object is not film writ large, but one specific camera. As the organization has evolved from a movement into more of a global lifestyle brand, furthermore, it is clear that its vision of an analog future is attached to ideas about the specific materiality of photographic technologies. Not only does one of its prophecies invoke the guarantee of originality, authenticity, and presence that supposedly extends from the materiality of photographic papers and films, but what has followed from this statement is a quickly expanding roster of film-related products like these. With that said, the lomographic attachment to analog photography is not strictly expressed in material terms. On the contrary, the organization has since 1995 maintained a website that continues to serve as an important community forum for sharing, connecting, and learning. Recent offerings from the brand have included a scanner and app, both designed to make it even easier to exchange images, participate in contests, and read magazine content about the latest in creative photography. It seems that analog photography is here not just a technological apparatus, is not just a material culture or a photographic way of seeing the world, it is also a sign of that culture, and even more to the point, a marker of belonging to that culture. We tend to use the word analog as a kind of shorthand, an ostensibly technical term that references a relation of continuity between image and world, or perhaps the graduation of tone on an individual photographic print. On a deeper level, we comprehend as we do so that its legibility is more properly as a technological and periodizing term, one that points to a body of technologies, a system of image production, the vision of a past era, and the specter of technological obsolescence, and that also carries with it the baggage of its many acquired associations with, say, the material and the real warmth and intimacy, contingency, and history. In its currency today, the broader term analog is not just a buzzword, but as I have said, a keyword, one that shapes the way we make sense of our media environment, our social spaces, our world. A closer look at the way the more specific category of analog photography has been figured and promulgated through, on the one hand, the life and work of a major artist like Dean, and on the other, a cultural phenomenon like lomography, reveals that the term's many semantic layers have culminated into the figure of an apparatus, an industrial legacy, and a material culture. For Dean, it is this whole system that serves as a site of reverie and devotion. For lomography, it is for this culture that the sign of analog photography, more than the reality of it, serves as a sign of participation and belonging. Thank you.
All right, that was a sharp 20 minutes.
Was it? Good.
Yes, it's perfect. Great. Thank you so much for this insightful and beautiful presentation. It's kind of funny, right, to see Tacita Dean and lomography together, but in fact they went well along quite well, right? So I thought this presentation was really interesting because it kind of touched a lot of topics and issues that we discussed the whole day, right? So there is this idea of analog photography as he's not there anymore to talk about it, but Guillaume Etier talked about the analog city as porous, imperfect, and I think we reinvest analog photography precisely for these imperfections, porousness. There was also the idea of lomography as in the first hand a product of proletariat photography, and that was created in the Soviet bloc. So there was really this whole thing. I'm trying not to make a long winding statement. Yeah, my advisor was like, yeah, sure. I don't think so. I am going to cut straight. In Tacita Dean's, there's this tension that right. So analog photography needs to keep its own properties, right? And yet that it needs to be reinvented. So to quote you, it needs to sustain itself and yet to reinvigorate itself, right? And Tacita Dean said in Art Forum, the article you quoted, that progress renders all technologies obsolete, and yet no medium is anachronistic to an artist. Mm-hmm. So I think that tension is key here. And she said later that it is crucial to keep the option available to have both analog and digital. And I would like to hear you on why is it crucial and extremely important, say. And
I'm not an artist, so I don't feel that I could answer that. I think we'd have to ask her directly. Look, what I'm trying to understand, I think, more is why
she thinks it's crucial,
or like even what it means that she sees it as crucial. I see, and what it is really about it that she sees as crucial.
And would you say that analog photography has become only very recently kind of a carrier of emotion, of tactility, of sensuality, or that it was always part of the medium's history? This kind of closeness with.
I don't think there's a simple answer to that. I think there have
Mhm,
always been a lot of ways of understanding
mhm,
photography.
mhm,
And part of what happened when the language of analog and digital were initially introduced was that it separated different like the complexity that already existed within photography
mhm,
and made it into a binary that like it falsified it in a way. So it's not that the qualities, it's not, I guess, like there was, of course, the big like indexicality debate that was ongoing, but then heated up, I
mhm,
guess, in the early 21st century in particular. But it's not exactly that. People hated calling photography indexical for a
mhm,
while. Probably
mhm.
you still shouldn't say the word.
Well,
But like,
I mean,
but it's not that that's like completely wrong. It's just that the binary that created made it wrong, and it made you not like,
mhm,
it just made you not even want to think about that or deal with it at
yeah,
all.
that's funny because Tacita Dean says, as an artist who makes and exhibits film for a reason indexical to the medium, she
Mhm.
felt that she needed to counteract this disappearance of the medium, right? Still
What's
in
when
art
was that
form.
from?
Art
Do you
forum.
the so that okay? So
Yeah,
she
so
was
I can
making
give you my sheet later.
yeah.
um, right. Um, is there any question, des questions, preguntas, whatever you want, André?
Just maybe a small question. Sorry, I missed maybe the beginning of your talk, so I had to deal with some urgent issue. But I remember just very recently there was a post about Tacita Dean complaining about labs closing and the decay of and so. And there was one answer or one person in the post. It was probably on Facebook or something. Said, there are X number of labs that have reopened since your apocalyptic statements of 2009, 10, where it was really just a whole lab and so on. And it led me to think in a way that part of Tacita Dean, and I'm not saying this to undermine in any way her importance as an artist, but part of her persona has developed as a kind of a savior, like in a sort of salvage paradigm of analog film, in such a way that she's maybe not as interested in looking at what is actually in the past maybe 5-6 years come back, and she's kind of still caught in this discourse of the disappearance and obsolescence and so on, which almost has become a kind of a way for her to situate herself within the art world. I wonder if this is something that you had thoughts on. I know that many people who have developed microfilm labs and artist-run labs, for instance, in the past 5-6 years, who have opened up new labs, who have been developing all these hand processing film and so on, find that she's not accounting what they've actually been doing for the last 10 years and kind of maintaining the discourse of disappearance and obsolescence.
I think that kind of response, though, is sometimes like exaggerating the health of the industry as well in a way that's equally ideologically loaded, like a legacy of the moment where everyone was crying that it wasn't going to die and it was not possible and film was going to be forever. I find like both of those positions equally ideologically loaded. Like certain so certain institutions are kind of coming back maybe, but film in particular, film and photography in particular, I think it still remains very like uncertain how healthy it is despite these like little signs of stirrings. Like you don't know how, I don't think we know yet how viable it is for the industry to continue in that way. So I see those, I see those both angles as being ideological.
So you've talked about this dichotomy between analog digital photography, and yet if analog photography manages to survive or even to thrive, is precisely because there is the possibility, or rather there is the whole all the possibilities that digital technology entails, internet, the possibility of buying films on the web, the possibility of seeing tutorials on YouTube, etc. So both are separated, and yet they are deeply enmeshed, and kind of you cannot untangle themselves, both of them, right?
Mhm. Well, I think it's clear that the dichotomy was a construct in the first place. So even like thinking of them in a binary in the way that you're doing right now is like only a product of the fact that this language was introduced in the 1980s.
All right. Oui. Vas-y, mon Dieu, Carl.
Just a quick
Our senior
parallel,
moments.
because it rings true exactly with what you're saying right now in the video game world. There's this notion of analog games that have emerged, which is completely in response to the ubiquity of the digital. But nobody ever called tabletop games analog game playing or anything like that. But now sadly it's everywhere. So I think it will go down in history as there was a period of analog game playing and a digital paradigm that followed. And it's though we make that comment all the time that it's silly, people still it's pragmatically it's in use now. It's unstoppable, I think.
Do you know David Sachs's book Revenge of the Analog? Yeah, I think he has a chapter, but his analog games are board games. Yeah.
Monsieur?
Yes, so I found your talk really interesting.
Thank you.
It had a lot of links to be made with the talk that was just before you with Zoe, because you study the objects, but mostly the practices around them. It's interesting to see how the museum and how those institutions try to crystallize those practices around specific objects.
You know what I thought was really interesting during Zoe's talk? I started thinking about, was interested for a little while in when this started displaying negatives in the museum. So I started thinking about the history of in the context of, I guess, the way that someone like Dean is framed too, as putting the apparatus on display in the museum gallery. Maybe you know more about that. I'm not asking you to talk right now, that's fine. Maybe we can talk later, but I thought it was really interesting to think about when more and more of the apparatus came to be exposed, I guess, within the display space of the gallery.
In my case, it's also a response to, I think, how the history of photography was written way earlier, as a history of technology that's completely separated from practice. So it's the idea, in a way, with the shows that I talked about is talking about technology, but within the sphere of practice and use and nitty-gritty stuff that was just excised from the history of photography in its very technologically determinist mode in the early 20th century, I would say. It's kind of a pushback against that. It's like reappropriating technology as part of the history of photography because it was evacuated at one point.
So, is there any... Monsieur Campon?
Je vais le faire en français, puis je vais aller dans plusieurs directions.
Splendide.
Mais en partant de ce que Zoé vient de dire, on fait toujours une distinction entre la technologie, l'esthétisme. Mais en fait, historiquement, on est toujours rébarbatif au changement aussi. Moi, quand j'ai commencé le travail sur les chambres noires, j'ai intitulé... mon premier intitulé de travail, j'ai parodié le titre de Benjamin, et j'ai appelé ça de l'obsolescence de la photographie argentique à l'ère de la reproductibilité numérique. C'est devenu le titre d'un texte que j'ai écrit, et j'ai annoncé déjà en 2015, pour moi c'était clair que dans quelques générations à venir, on ne parlerait plus de la photographie analogique. En fait, il y a une relation à faire aussi entre la technologie et l'économie. Et bon, peut-être qu'il y a des affaires à faire pour l'humographie, parce qu'il y a, comme il y en a avec Polaroid, et ça a une attirance particulièrement pour les jeunes générations. On pourrait dire la même chose dans le cinéma aussi. Il y a des gens qui créent de la pellicule cinématographique pour tourner en analogique. Ils recréent de la pellicule argentique. Je ne veux pas me perdre. Donc, la relation entre technologie et économie, ben, on oublie souvent aussi que il n'y a plus de recherche et de développement, que Minolta a disparu, que Kodak a fermé des centaines de laboratoires Kodachrome, qu'on ne fabrique plus le film Kodachrome. Et on pourrait en nommer comme ça, on pourrait faire un chapelet de... En fait, il y a une relation. Si ce n'est pas rentable, on ferme. C'est pas compliqué. On met des ouvriers à pied et on ferme les usines et les gens qui ont des parts dans les actions, ils partent avec la cagnotte. Je fais référence au vinyle, par exemple, en musique. Pourquoi la disparition? En fait, on peut dire qu'on peut annoncer au moment où on se parle la disparition à court terme de l'enregistrement audio numérique du CD au profit des plateformes d'écoute qui ne payent pas de taxes au Canada, ou encore le fait que, par exemple, le vinyle a un essor inouï. Le vinyle a un essor inouï, c'est tout à fait relatif, parce que contrairement à la photographie, la masse critique qui achète les vinyles est beaucoup plus importante que la masse critique qui achète les films et le papier et la chimie et qui retourne dans les chambres noires. En fait, je vais provoquer quelque chose. Peut-être, je pense que peut-être que cette femme, elle est fétichiste elle-même et nostalgique elle-même du matériau qu'elle a utilisé pendant sa vie entière. Moi, à peine 3 semaines avant de faire mon projet sur les chambres noires, je jurais à qui voulait m'entendre que j'allais finir mes jours dans la chambre noire avec l'analogique. Et du jour au lendemain, quand j'ai eu cette idée de photographier les chambres noires, j'ai eu à prendre une décision. Comment je le fais? Je le fais avec le numérique et je le fais au flash. Et voilà. Mais je peux très bien comprendre. Je veux dire, il y a toujours cette réticence à aller de l'avant. Moi, aujourd'hui, je fais mon travail avec un téléphone cellulaire, un numériseur et essentiellement, j'oublie-tu quelque chose? Des tirages au jet d'encre et des fichiers.
Moi, je sais pas. Là, je suis au téléphone aussi.
Bref, j'ai dit tout ça. Vous en faites ce que vous voulez.